The life of a whistleblower is a complicated and daunting one. People who expose secrets make enemies very quickly, and in many cases they're either forced to go off the radar for a while, or in the worst circumstances are made to disappear by the people they spoke up against, never to be seen or heard from again. Number 10. Ross Alderson worked for the British Columbia Lottery Corporation from 2008 to 2017. And just before his resignation and strange disappearance, he held the position of Director of Money Laundering and Investigations. His resignation came as a result of certain discrepancies that he noticed while working for the corporation. And in 2017, he decided to take his findings directly to the media. He had discovered a complicated money laundering operation within the company and decided to fulfill his duty by reporting his findings. He stated that at one point, he started noticing large amounts of money in small bills being delivered to high rollers and casinos. The money was usually wrapped in packages or was delivered in vehicles that he didn't recognize. One of the establishments in question was the River Rock Casino in Richmond, British Columbia, and he, along with a few other investigators, decided to take a closer look at the casino's dealings. They started to believe that the money was being brought to the casino by members of the criminal underworld, after which it was distributed to high rollers who were gambling there. It seemed like the perfect way to launder ill-gotten money, and Ross knew he had to do something to put a stop to it. One day while he was in the casino, he noticed that a suspicious transaction was taking place. A payout of $100,000 was being made in $20 bills, which was very unusual, and he decided to intervene. But as soon as he did so, he was accosted by the casino's manager, who then reported him to the British Columbia Lottery Corporation. He was called in and told to stop investigating the casino, since he was only expected to observe the activities that took place there, and then report back to his superiors. He was also forbidden from talking to gamblers in the establishment, and he soon started to believe that his superiors in the corporation were part of the problem. Further investigation revealed that these very issues had been brought to the corporation's attention many times in the past, when police officers and investigators had noticed this suspicious activity, but they were told to either drop their queries or they were simply ignored. Nevertheless, Ross completed a comprehensive report in 2015, in which he recommended that any transactions over $20,000 that were to be paid out to the high rollers had to first be verified by the casino's service providers, but his recommendation fell on deaf ears. Hence, in 2017, he felt he no longer had a choice but to go public with his findings, since he refused to become involved in a complicated and dangerous criminal enterprise. In 2020, he was summoned to attend the Commission of Inquiry into Money Laundering in British Columbia, but he failed to show up. When no one could get a hold of him, many more attempts were made to contact Ross, but in vain, as no one had any idea where he had disappeared to. It would then come to light that Ross had relocated to Australia after he was constantly harassed over his claims, and he started to fear for his life and that of his family. He eventually presented his findings to the Cullen Commission via video link in 2021, and his concerns were confirmed. It remains unknown whether anyone was arrested as a result, but Ross received the Peter Bryce Prize for Ethical Leadership and Whistleblowing in 2023. Number 9. The COVID-19 pandemic that broke in 2019 affected the entire world as people were forced into lockdown, during which they were only allowed out of their houses under specific circumstances, and were required to wear face masks whenever they went public. Members of the public were growing increasingly concerned as the number of infected patients started to spike dramatically, and many decided to conduct their own investigations. A Chinese citizen called Fang Bin took it upon himself to find some answers, and soon he was in a lot of trouble. Fang started recording videos in Wuhan, where the outbreak had started, in an effort to reveal the truth to the world. He started posting his footage to YouTube in an effort to gain as much exposure as possible, an act that was heavily frowned upon by the Chinese government. It had already come to light that the government had been less than truthful about the outbreak, and that there had been a 3-week delay between the disease being identified and the truth about its rapid spread being announced. But this was merely the tip of the iceberg. On one occasion, Fang visited a hospital in the area and recorded footage of the overcrowded corridors, with many people left untreated due to the sheer number of patients. More concerning was his footage showing many deceased patients being loaded into a van. And as soon as that video was uploaded, it caused panic among Chinese residents who'd been kept in the dark up to that point. In one of the last videos that he uploaded, he showed footage of undercover police officers surrounding his house, and then he suddenly vanished. For almost 3 years, no one had any idea what had happened to Fang, and his family, as well as his YouTube followers, were concerned he'd been abducted or silenced by the Chinese government. It would only later come to light that he and several other whistleblowers had been arrested to ensure their silence on the pandemic. He was charged with picking quarrels and provoking trouble, and told not to speak to anyone while he was incarcerated. In 2023, it was finally revealed that he would be released from prison, but he remained under supervision by the government. Normally, someone charged with that crime can only be held for 6 months, but Fang remained in prison for 3 years before being allowed to return to society. Number 8. In 2014, Val Brooksmith was living in Los Angeles, California, where he worked as a musician. But he was born in Ukraine, and in 1979, his parents, Alla and Alexander, decided to immigrate to the US to start a new and better life for their family. They settled in Chicago before his parents got divorced, and his mother eventually remarried another man before relocating to New Jersey. In 2014, though, Val's life would take a most unexpected turn when his father, who was a Dutch bank executive, passed away. After his father's passing, Val gained access to his computer, and upon opening his father's email account, he found some very interesting information. He stumbled upon hundreds of files connected to the Dutch bank, which he knew would be of interest to the authorities. A federal and state investigation had been launched against the bank, as it was suspected that its employees were taking part in misconduct. Knowing this, Val decided to offer his father's files to the FBI in New York, but he first met with agents in Los Angeles. After revealing what he had found, the FBI gave Val permission to identify himself as a witness in the ongoing investigation, and he leaked the files to several media outlets, as well as a research firm called Fusion GPS, which was investigating the Dutch bank's relationship with President Donald Trump. Then, on the 7th of April, 2021, Val suddenly disappeared. It came to light that in 2019, he'd been subpoenaed to release certain documents to the House Intelligence Committee, which was investigating a matter involving Russia. It was believed that the Dutch bank had recruited Russian money launderers and that several other financial institutions were possibly involved in the scheme. He had also supplied sensitive information to a journalist for the New York Times and Forensic News, both of which published articles about the alleged money laundering and misconduct. After Val was reported missing, the police revealed that he was last seen at around 4 p.m. at Griffith Park in Los Angeles, where he had dropped his girlfriend off. He was supposed to get her and her son later that afternoon, but never showed up. When he still hadn't returned home by the next morning, his girlfriend used the Find My iPhone app to trace his phone, and she discovered that his car was abandoned in South Central Los Angeles with the engine still running. The car was searched, but it offered no further clues, and the police left baffled as to what happened to him. It was suggested that his cooperation with the authorities was a factor in his disappearance, but this could not be confirmed. These fears were finally squashed when Val suddenly reappeared in 2022, but he was then arrested for carrying a firearm that he had constructed himself. He'd used that weapon to make threats against employees of the Brewery Art Colony, and a restraining order was issued against him. By this time, it seemed to the authorities that Val had become homeless, and they revealed that he'd been displaying some worrying behavior, having threatened several other people with his homemade firearm. Later that same month, the police announced that Val had been found deceased on the Wilson High School campus in El Sereno, and it was determined he'd lost his life after falling out of a tree and sustaining head and spinal injuries. Many people believe this was no accident, and Val's strange behavior before his passing pointed to something more sinister, but this was never confirmed, and the true cause of his sudden disappearance remains unknown. Number 7. The case involving Frederick Valentiche, an Australian man who in 1978 was studying towards a career as a domestic pilot, is a strange one indeed. and to this day his sudden disappearance remains unsolved. By the time of his disappearance, Frederick was by no means an experienced pilot. He'd flown for about 150 hours, but he'd reached the level of competence that allowed him to fly at night, as long as visibility was good enough to allow for the identification of certain landmarks. He'd applied for his commercial pilot license in the past, but failed the exam, and had also been rejected by the Royal Australian Air Force. He'd also shown some other issues, having been told off for purposefully flying into a cloud and knowingly entering prohibited airspace. According to those who knew him, Frederick was known to be a believer in UFOs, and he'd spoken to his girlfriend about his fears of being abducted by extraterrestrials. This did not deter him from his dream of becoming a pilot, though, and on the 21st of October, 1978, he took off from an airport in Melbourne in a light single-seat Cessna. He planned to fly a distance of about 150 miles, passing over the Bass Strait in Cape Otway before arriving in King Island. The flight should have taken an hour and 10 minutes, and Frederick felt he was prepared. Strangely, he never asked for the airport's runway lights to be turned on for his arrival, but since visibility was good with fair weather, there weren't any obvious concerns. That is, until shortly after his takeoff that night. At one point, Frederick contacted air traffic control to report that he had spotted something strange in the sky. When he managed to get a closer look, he realized it was some kind of unidentifiable craft, which then started following his plane. He relayed this information, and a short while later, stated that the craft was now hovering above his plane, and he made sure to mention that it wasn't any type of aircraft that he'd ever seen before. In the recording of his conversation with air traffic control, the next 17 seconds were completely silent, after which a strange metallic scraping sound could be heard. Further efforts to contact Frederick were fruitless, and when he didn't arrive at Kings Island, a search effort was started. Ships were used to search the Bass Strait. Civilian and military aircraft then scoured the ground below for any sign of his plane. And over the span of 4 days, an area of around 2,600 square miles was covered, with no sign of the missing man or his plane. The search was eventually abandoned, and as is to be expected, conspiracy theories started to crop up. The Australian government stated that his disappearance was classified as unexplained, but it was suggested that Frederick's plane had suffered mechanical failure, or that he may have become disoriented after spotting the strange object near his plane, causing him to crash. There are also some people who believe he fabricated the sighting as a ruse, so that he could disappear intentionally, but his family and friends dispute this, since he was excited about his future career as a pilot. Number 6. During the coronavirus outbreak, there was a lot of talk about what should be done to keep the general public safe, and what measures should be taken to stop the spread of the disease as quickly as possible. But many people seemingly forgot about the safety of the doctors and nurses who were tasked with treating infected patients, many of whom lost their lives after being exposed to the virus during the course of their duties. One doctor in particular, A. Fenn, started speaking out on this subject while serving as the director of the emergency department at the Wuhan Central Hospital in China. She'd witnessed many of her colleagues' health deteriorate before eventually passing away, and she felt that more could have been done by the Chinese government to curb the rapid spread of the disease. She became critical of the authorities in the medical sector after she learned that the early warning signs of the pandemic were suppressed and kept from the public, and she made sure to mention this while being interviewed by Renwu magazine. The interview was later uploaded to the internet, and almost immediately Chinese censors started deleting the video from the sites where it could be viewed. It became clear that A had touched a nerve, but she had further news to share with the world. She stated that in December of 2019, she started noticing that several patients in her care showed worrying signs of SARS-like symptoms. And when she brought this to the attention of her superiors, she was given a reprimand and told to keep quiet. Before long, her concerns were confirmed when the first case of the COVID-19 pandemic occurred, and just months later, 4 doctors working at the hospital had lost their lives. By that time, more than 3,000 people in China had succumbed to the disease, and A, along with many other doctors, started exposing the poor conditions in Wuhan. Her superiors later state that A was told to keep her concerns to herself since the hospital didn't want to cause panic among the public, but she found the fact that the information was completely suppressed, even from the media, suspicious. 2 days after submitting her report, she was called into the head of the hospital's disciplinary committee's office and given a warning for harming the hospital's stability and spreading false rumors. The rest of the hospital staff was told not to speak to anyone about the virus, and they were given protective clothing to wear while on duty. Soon, the hospital was filling up with new cases, and still the Chinese government refused to acknowledge that the disease was being spread from human to human. 8 more doctors were reprimanded for speaking out about the true extent of the impending pandemic, despite their fears having been proven true by that point. 2 weeks after speaking with the media, A suddenly went missing, and her colleagues were unable to make contact with her. Luckily, she would reappear in April of that year, when she posted a photo of herself at work with the caption, "Happy April Fool's Day." She would later state she was not a whistleblower, but rather considered herself as the person who supplied the whistleblowers with the necessary whistle. Number 5. In the minds of most people, different law enforcement agencies work together to solve crimes and to ensure the safety of the public, but this isn't always the case. Sometimes one such agency will try to interfere with an investigation that's being conducted by another in order to cover up its own wrongdoing. This was what happened in the case involving a prison inmate named Anthony Brown. While he was incarcerated in Los Angeles, the FBI started becoming suspicious of several Los Angeles sheriff's deputies who were seemingly involved in corruption, but they had no way of proving it. They then decided to run a sting operation inside the prison and contacted Brown to see if he'd be willing to cooperate with the agency. He agreed and was tasked with gathering evidence against these deputies so they could be brought to justice. Any information that he had for the FBI was relayed by telephone, but as soon as Brown started supplying such information, the sheriff's department started listening in on his calls, and panic ensued. The calls were traced back to the FBI. Fearing that they would be exposed for the criminals that they are, deputies concocted a plan to ensure Brown's silence. To the FBI, it seemed as though he'd suddenly disappeared and they were unable to locate him, even after asking officials where Brown was. He had already revealed that the prison where he was being held was being run very poorly, and that no efforts were being made to improve the conditions there. Many inmates were subjected to beatings that were often unprovoked. Ironically, an undercover FBI agent had managed to smuggle a cell phone into Brown's cell after conspiring with a corrupt prison guard who accepted a $1,500 bribe to break the rules. The operation was off to a good start, but it came to a standstill when Brown suddenly went missing. For 18 days, the FBI did all they could to locate him, but they were unable to find any information on his whereabouts and were continually given the runaround by prison staff and the sheriff's department deputies. There were fears that his life had been ended inside the prison and that it was being covered up by officials, but this could of course not be proven. It would later come to light that Brown had gathered information on illegal substance smuggling, organized fighting, and other corrupt activities in the prison, and after a deputy found the smuggled cell phone in his cell, he was made to disappear. First, his name was changed on the prison's register, after which he was removed from his cell and taken elsewhere. When the prison records were checked, they showed that Brown had been released from the sheriff's office custody. When Brown was finally returned, he revealed that he was on several occasions forced into a car in the dead of night before being whisked away to an unknown location. At least 12 guards were tasked with watching him around the clock. He feared for his life, and when all was said and done, he filed a lawsuit against the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department, specifically former Sheriff Lee Baca and former Undersheriff Paul Tanaka, who were found to be involved in the kidnapping scheme. Number 4. Eamon Malloy, a 22-year-old man who hailed from the Ardoyne area of northern Belfast in Ireland, was described by his friends and family as a quiet, shy, and thoughtful man who often put the needs of those less fortunate than him before his own. He was a snooker enthusiast who, at the time of his suspicious disappearance, had started learning to play the mandolin. Due to his calm and friendly nature, he'd made a lot of friends who couldn't understand why he would suddenly go missing. What caused them the most concern was the fact that Eamon had disappeared during the Troubles in North Ireland, which saw continued fighting between the Catholics, who wanted to see Ireland reunited, and the Protestant Unionists, who wanted the country to remain a part of the United Kingdom. This battle had been going on since 1968, and it would only come to an end in 1998, when the Good Friday Agreement was struck, after it was decided that the Catholics and Protestants should share power in the country. It was on the 1st of July, 1975, that Eamon suddenly disappeared, and it was revealed that he was last seen at his house in Ardoyne that day. He was a staunch Catholic, and it was feared by his friends and family that he might have been abducted due to his political views. His family searched far and wide in hopes of locating him, but for the next 25 years, they would find no clues as to what happened to him. In 1999, news broke that his remains had been found inside a coffin in a cemetery. The coffin had not been interred, and so no exhumation was required, and Eamon was quickly identified. After his funeral was held, the truth about his disappearance finally came to light when his family received a visit from a priest. He stated in 1975 he was working in County Louth when one night a group of men arrived at his house and knocked on the door. They told him that someone had been gravely injured in a car accident nearby, and that one patient had asked for a priest. He agreed to accompany him, but while being driven away from his house, he was told that he was actually being taken to see a prisoner, with whom they believed was an informant. He was scheduled to be executed, and hence needed a priest to hear his last confession. He was then taken to a mobile home in a secluded area, and there he saw Eamon for the first time. His hands and feet were bound, and he was visibly distressed, having been told of his impending fate. The priest decided not to go to the police for fear of his own safety. Eamon had at last been found, but it was later revealed that he was just one of dozens of people who were abducted by the Irish Republican Army, many of whom suffered the same fate as Eamon's. Number 3. Flora Vovshin was born in New York in 1923. As an adult, she attended Columbia University, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Bernard College, where she became a member of the American Students' Union. It was there that she met Marian Berdicio and Judith Kaplan while voicing her support for the Soviet Union. She was also heavily opposed to the fact that the US had rendered aid to the UK in 1941. In 1943, she started working for the Office of War Information, which during the Second World War had seen some of its employees influenced by the Soviet Union. The Office of War Information was at the time in charge of overseeing the Voice of America language services and broadcasts, and soon Flora started working with the KGB. She recruited Judith Kaplan, who then followed suit, and before long, Flora started impressing her handlers with the amount of information she was gathering while posing as a librarian at the Office of War Information. But she seemingly got carried away in her role and had to be reprimanded by the KGB, who felt that she was becoming careless. They feared that her cover would be blown and that they would lose a valuable asset who could provide them with inside information. What counted in her favor, though, was the fact that she spoke several languages, including French, Russian, and Slavic languages. The FBI had started suspecting that someone inside the Office of War Information was relaying information to the KGB, and when the war finally came to an end, they started searching for that informant. Having learned of this, Flora decided to relocate to the Soviet Union, and upon her arrival there, she denounced her American citizenship. This was never confirmed, and from the perspective of the FBI, she'd simply disappeared without a trace, never to be seen again. It would later come to light, thanks to a document that was found in the 1990s, that several other spies were working for the KGB at the Office of War Information during the war, and that Flora was only one of many informants who were never identified. While Flora might not have been the most effective of these informants, it was later learned that she was the one who recruited Judith Kaplan, who managed to relay some very important sensitive information to the KGB, much of which dealt with US counterintelligence measures. Furthermore, it was discovered that Flora's mother, Maria Witcher, was an activist for the US Communist Party, along with her stepfather. Her mother was known under the codename Dasha, while her stepfather was known as Keen. Documents were discovered later on that showed that they worked with the KGB and that Witcher had supplied them with information on the electronic devices that were being used by the US military during the war. In the meantime, the FBI was still doing all it could to find Flora so that she could be prosecuted as a traitor, but her whereabouts remained unknown. Her mother would later state that she received news from the Soviet Union that Flora had passed away, but this was never definitively confirmed. Number 2. During the early part of the 1960s, Elizabeth Lawson, who originally hailed from Scotland, was working as an au pair in New York when she got pregnant. She eventually gave birth to a daughter that she named Paula, and had to raise her as a single mom since Paula's father was no longer in the picture. Soon after Paula was born, Elizabeth decided to move back to Scotland, but when her parents asked about Paula's father, she refused to reveal his identity. This left her family perplexed, but they decided to let sleeping dogs lie and didn't push the matter any further. But as is to be expected, as Paula got older, she also started asking questions about her father. This would often send Elizabeth into a rage, and she would simply tell her daughter to shut up, often receiving a slap in the face in the process. There was clearly something that Elizabeth was withholding from her family, but she remained tight-lipped and would simply refuse to discuss the matter with anyone. Paula eventually settled in Fife, Scotland, after Elizabeth passed away, and she took the opportunity to do some research on her father's identity. She decided to submit her DNA to a genealogy lab, and when the results came back, she was surprised to find that she had relatives who were living in the US. Her mother had never mentioned any family living there, and she was immediately intrigued. Further investigation revealed that her father's name was Billy Elson Lawson, a man who had mysteriously disappeared after it was discovered he was an informant for the police who'd revealed a lot of information on the mob. He would have known that if his secret was ever revealed to members of the criminal underground, he would be in serious danger, but for some time he managed to gather information while remaining undetected as an informant. But at some point after he and Elizabeth had met, someone in the mob found out about his true intentions, and it was decided that his life should be ended. The details of this incident were unknown at the time, but it was certain that a hitman was sent after Billy, who only just managed to escape with his life intact. It would be impossible for him to remain in New York, since he was now known to every criminal connected to the mob, and knowing that it would only be a matter of time before they caught up with him, he decided to flee to Texas. There, he met and married a woman, but after that marriage failed, he relocated to New Jersey. He got married again there, but that marriage didn't last long. He finally settled in Arkansas, where he lived out the rest of his days. Paula would later learn that neither of Billy's wives ever learned of his dangerous past, but she needed to know more about her father. She tracked down and spoke to several of Billy's family members, many of whom were wary of speaking to her, but she eventually found some answers. She learned that after Billy was ousted as an informant, someone planted an explosive device in his apartment, but when it was detonated, he wasn't at home. Elizabeth was seemingly aware of his work with the police, and she swore never to tell a soul where Billy was or why he'd suddenly gone missing. Paula found out that in 2009, Billy had been diagnosed with pneumonia and pancreatic cancer, and he passed away soon after while still living in Arkansas. Number 1. In January of 2016, a Chinese journalist called Li Chen went missing, and the case made headlines in newspapers across the country. It was reported by Amnesty International that he was last seen on the 11th of January that year, and it was speculated that he may have fled in fear for his life. On the day that Chen went missing, he contacted his partner via SMS, stating that he was on his way to the border between Thailand and Laos. His partner would receive a call from the Changwon police station on the 2nd of February that year, and was told that Ching would make contact the following day. This proved to be true, as she received a phone call from him on the 3rd of February, and the true events concerning his disappearance then came to light. He was forced to flee after it became apparent that his life was in danger, not because of something he had done, but because of something he'd refused to do. Ching stated that just before he disappeared, he'd been approached by Chinese state security officials who started putting pressure on him to act as their informant against his fellow journalists. But they also wanted information on his family, friends, and acquaintances, which struck Ching as suspicious. And he immediately felt that working with these officials would have had disastrous consequences. He felt he had no choice but to flee, since he was told that his refusal to cooperate would result in his being sent to prison as a traitor. He knew that his family's lives were also at risk, but he refused to work as an informant and absconded to India. It could not have been an easy decision, since he and his partner had a 2-year-old daughter. When he fled, they had to remain in China alone, and he feared that they'd be retaliated against. Once he arrived in India, he applied for asylum but was rejected. He then looked for an alternative and relocated to Thailand, where he planned to apply for asylum, but it wasn't known whether he ever did this, since he suddenly disappeared in Thailand. Having not heard from Chen for some time, his partner became concerned that the Chinese state security officials in question had located him, and that he'd either been abducted, as is so often the case, or he was no longer alive. It would then come to light that while he was in India, Chen had contacted several journalists and supplied them with the list of topics that he and his fellow journalists were not allowed to cover by order of the Chinese government. He also revealed that he'd intended to spy on some of these journalists, having been forced to do so by officials, but he soon found that he could no longer morally do so, and hence he decided to flee. Chen was not the first journalist to follow this specific path. 3 other reporters were forced to flee to Thailand for the same reasons, all of whom were eventually returned to China by the Thai government, which was cooperating with the Chinese government on such matters. And in one case, 2 journalists who'd received refugee status from the United Nations were deported back to China after they were accused of immigration violations that never even occurred. Ching would eventually resurface in China months after his disappearance, but he remained under investigation and could not tell his partner where he was for fear of her safety. It remains unknown whether he ever returned home, as information on his life after returning to China has never been made public. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.